to hit record last time, so it should start, let's see. Okay, so it's recording now, so that can,
And I just got off for, that's, don't worry, I'm coming right back.
okay.
Just have to, because what happened was when I was setting this up, it took a bunch of photos of me
Oh, no.
turning the volume up, and I'm just erasing that off because that'll distract me when I'm looking at the slideshow. It takes a second here. That's it. Now I'm back there, back to the roll, and there we go. Be back. Okay, good.
Fantastic. So we are just having about another minute or so. Everything otherwise been well with you, keeping busy?
Yes, yeah. We started to do some in-person lectures at, I was at the University Club last week, for instance.
Oh, wow.
So we're starting to see that come back online, which is great. And I know Columbia Club is talking with the Penn Club about doing something like in person, but a hybrid. That's what we're doing lately. So the idea is just have a small group, have 10, 20 people, 30 people, depending on how big the ballroom is.
Yeah.
University Club was a huge room, so we had 35 people. Normally, it could fit hundreds, but then have it where people are still watching at home, so you could do both.
Perfect. And with that, we are at 6 o'clock. So I'm going to start us off and hit open and we'll get going. Let's see, start webinar.
Oh, you don't mind if I do a plug at New York Historical Tours?
No,
right?
of course. Always welcome for you to do that.
Just so they have my name, and I'll just give the website so they can reach out to me.
Oh, perfect. And also if you want to add it into the chat box as well, that would be great. So good evening, everyone. We'll just wait a couple moments for some more people to join us before we get started this evening. And actually, Kevin, if you want to add into the chat box your website and contact information now so we don't forget at the end.
Yes, let me see if I can do that here. I'll just put that in so they have it. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Oh, I think that was to all panelists. What I'll do is let me copy that and just do that to the entire group. Ooh, now let's see if I can try that again. So what I've done is in the chat box, I have entered Kevin's name and his website for everyone who has any follow-up questions after tonight's lecture can reach out to Kevin directly. And we'll start off here now that we're a couple minutes after 6 p.m. Thank you again for joining us tonight. My name is Alana Butera, and I am the president and head of appraisals and sales advisory at Butera Art Advisory and Management. Tonight, I'm thrilled to be hosting renowned New York historian Kevin Draper, who will be discussing the rise of the New York City art gallery scene in the 20th century. Kevin is co-founder of New York Historical Tours. An impassioned New Yorker, Kevin brings to life the stories and history that has made New York one of the most exciting and dynamic cities in the world. Kevin has led historical talks and lectures for top universities and Fortune 500 companies and has been a consultant to a variety of publications, including CBS, ABC, Bloomberg, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. I'll hand it over to Kevin in just a minute, but for those of you who don't know me, I'd like to say a word or two about our firm. Butera Art Advisory is a full-service independent art appraisal, sales advisory, and collection management firm. Whether through virtual or in-person appointments, our specialists and project managers are available to assist you and your clients. Our team of experts span all areas of fine and decorative art, jewelry, classic cars and motorcycles, fine and rare wine and spirits, coins, and other collectibles. On this call this evening, we are joined by our Vice President, Ginny Butera, and by various specialists and project managers from our various offices. In addition to the Butera Art Advisory team, I'm also joined by my colleagues at AlterView Advisors, a business valuation and real estate appraisal firm. When I asked Kevin to talk about the art galleries of New York City, I know I was asking him for the impossible. Art galleries are everywhere in the city, from Brooklyn to Queens and throughout Manhattan, with the largest concentration of gallery spaces in a single neighborhood being in Chelsea. In fact, I have read that not only does Chelsea have the largest concentration of gallery spaces in New York, but in fact in any city in the world. By some estimates, there are approximately 1,500 galleries across New York City covering all periods of art history, a truly astounding number when you think about it. By contrast, New York has only approximately 100 bookstores. Broadway only has approximately 40 theaters. And before I turn it over to Kevin, a quick housekeeping note. All attendees will be muted during the lecture. Please enter your questions for Kevin into the chat box, and we will be answering them at the end of the talk. A recording of this presentation will also be made available. Kevin?
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody, and good evening. So what we're going to do tonight, yes, obviously the gallery talk as we just explained, but what I also want to give a little bit of background and history to and kind of lay out tonight is how did New York City become what most would consider to be one of the art capitals of the world now in the 21st century, but how did that happen? How did that come about? And we're going to start when I sort of lay this out and how this happened. How did it go from Europe? How did the center of the art world come to, most people would say America, but I'm going to make the case tonight that it's really centered in New York City. So that's what I'm going to sort of lay out. And we're going to be concentrating mainly on the first half of the 20th century. And again, kind of laid out, why did artists want to move here, work here, sell their work here? Why did the museum scene, how come there's so many art museums in New York? How did that come about? So that's a little bit of what we're going to be laying out tonight. Now, just to give us a little background and kind of lay the groundwork here, you're looking at a photo which would be known as a period of time known as the Gilded Age. This is basically from the 1870s up through about 1819. The history of New York, by the way, is about, we're looking at a 400-year history. It started in the 1620s when we were New Amsterdam and up till today, so almost 400 years. For the first 250 years of that history, New York City and the country itself was considered a very backwards place compared to Europe. You would never consider us a financial capital, cultural capital, or anything in between. But during the Gilded Age, during this period of time that we're looking at right here, during the Gilded Age, starting in the 1870s, all of this is going to change. We're going to see New York first rise as becoming one of the financial capitals of the world. We're also going to be slowly becoming an intellectual capital of the world, a fashion capital, and eventually a cultural and art capital. So this is where it's going to begin. Now, for the most part, during this period of time, which, by the way, this is Fifth Avenue, the mansions you're looking at, this is where the Astors live, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, and so on. Now, the one thing about the architecture and just about everything we were doing in America, we were copying from the Europeans. And when it came to art, the one thing that we were doing in terms of art, especially those with enough wealth, we were buying from Europe. So when anybody thought of art, usually we would have dealers that would go over and purchase this artwork, mostly European masters, bringing them back, and people were actually displaying them salon style in their mansions. So this would be the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, going into the 20th century. But again, this was just mainly for a select few, if you happen to be invited to someone's home, that you would actually get to see these works of art. For the most part, the idea of going out to see any kind of artwork was unheard of really anywhere in America up to this point. And if anybody had any interest in learning about art and wanting to perhaps become an artist, you definitely would go to Europe and most likely go to Paris. But as we get into the 20th century, this is slowly but surely going to be changing. And what really kicks the door open, which is really going to lay the foundations for, they'll say America, but I'll keep saying New York, becoming one of the art capitals of the world, is an event that's going to take place in 1913 here in New York City. Most people will know this as the Armory Show of 1913. The official title was the International Exhibition of Modern Art. Now, by the way, the actual symbol for the fair and the entire event was basically the pine tree that you see, the pine tree flag, which is actually it's from the American Revolution, believe it or not, and it's actually meant to symbolize the new spirit. So that's a lot of what they were trying to come across to people during this art fair, was this idea of a new spirit. And then what exactly was this, the Armory Show? What was it really about? Well, it was mainly an exhibition of modern art. And what they would display here in New York City, down in what is today is known as Chelsea, at the Armory, would be some 1,300 paintings and sculptures and decorative arts by some 300 avant-garde European, and the key to this is American artists. You have Impressionists and Cubist works that are definitely highly represented at this show. Now, the reason that this show is so important, and the reason that this is really going to shift the art world really and have it shift to New York, is mainly the reactions to not only the critics, but New Yorkers that actually went to the show. Now, to give you an example of some of these artists that were on display, some of these 1,300 paintings, what you would have in these different galleries that were set up in the Armory. For the first time, people would actually see Picasso's, Rodin's, Mary Cassatt, Paul Cézanne, Henri Matisse, Claude Monet, Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Edgar Degas, and on and on and on. This would be literally the first time that anyone would be exposed to these artists, most of them European at the time, and not only these artists, but this new type of art that they were painting. They were bringing out in the open for the first time for people to really experience. Now, what made this show such a big deal is basically it was considered scandalous. The headlines would be scandalous sensation. The media perceived the exhibition and the way they described it, it was the promotion of anarchy, insanity, and immorality. Now, whenever you describe something like that, usually the first thing that'll do is that'll get people to want to actually go and see it. What's immoral about this? So if anything, a lot of the negative criticism that this exhibition originally was receiving helped it actually, because it made people really want to go and see this. They really wanted to know what was going on at this event. But again, the backlash was pretty intense, because even the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, said that none of this was art. At least that's what he felt. And he actually said quite a few other things that I can't repeat, but he was definitely not a fan of this fair. But again, this is the key moment in the American art scene, because this is what's really going to put America on the map. Now, it was actually sponsored by the people that actually put this together was the Association. I just want to get you another. I just want to show you the gallery again. The Association of American Painters and Sculptors. They're the ones that actually helped put this exhibition together. Now, I just want to go over and I want to explain a couple of the artists that were here and explain a few of the paintings that were actually shown, because not only does this really blow open the door to a whole new field and a whole new way of looking at art, but it also would take the wealthy at first class of New York that thought the only thing worth buying were like European masters, for instance. What this fair is going to do, it's going to make people look and want other art that's not European masters, not stuff that's necessarily being created in Europe. And I'm going to point out a couple of American artists that were actually creating some of the art here. But with that, you're going to see proliferation really all over the city of art galleries, because people are going to be very interested and want to buy this artwork. People are going to want this for their homes, for their apartments. So this is really going to create an entire new industry in New York City. It was here slightly before, but not on the scale that we're going to see after this Armory Show. So again, the idea of galleries, art dealers, it's really going to take off after this. Now, one of the main paintings that probably got the most talk at this Armory Show was this one by Marcel Duchamp, which is entitled "Nude Descending a Staircase." This is the one that really got a lot of attention. This basically what it would be described at the time as sort of this cubist, futurist type painting. So again, these are terms that most Americans never heard of. They definitely didn't understand it. A lot of newspapers called it, it's not the nude descending a staircase, it's rude descending a staircase. And another review that we had in New York here, in one of the local newspapers that got front page press, they called it, this particular work, an explosion in a shingle factory. And a lot of people kept commenting, "Where's the nude?" They didn't know where the nude person was. So again, something is like this piece of artwork is extremely important because it really will open the mind to New Yorkers and Americans about what else there is out there in the art world. And even the exhibition itself would get artists to paint the actual events. So paintings made of the actual event became very popular. Now, one of the American artists that were featured here, now this is going to play into why New York City is so important, because you're going to have a lot of American painters from all over the United States that normally would think to go to Europe, especially Paris, to learn how to paint, and probably would stay there and try to make a living somewhere in Europe. But because of this fair, people like John Sloan would actually decide to stay in America, and not only stay in America, but John Sloan, who was featured here at the event, he is considered one of the founders of the Ashcan School. So his style of painting, which I'm going to explain in a moment, would take off in New York, and it would create an entirely new business reel here in New York of what John Sloan would start to create. And again, he's considered one of the founders of the Ashcan School. Ashcan School is actually more, they themselves, it's sort of like almost making fun of the work they're doing. So that's where that term comes from. It wasn't an actual school, but it was just a type of painting style. But the reason I want to really point this out is because how important the work that he, in particular, John Sloan, is going to do here in New York City. Now, what John Sloan is going to do, and this is a very, very important moment in New York City, and this is actually called McSorley's, which is actually a bar that's still here in New York. It's considered one of the oldest bars in New York. And what John Sloan did when he painted this, and what the Ashcan School was going to do, and what other American painters are going to do throughout the teens, the 20s, 30s, the 40s, they're going to look at, especially in New York, just the basic New Yorker's way of living and paint it. Stuff that scenes that most people would think, why would anybody want to paint that? And why would anybody buy that? But they're really going to turn the art world on its head, because here, especially in New York, painting regular everyday scenes will be a whole new movement in the art world. And this was actually one of the paintings that John Sloan featured at the event. And not only that, but what John Sloan was doing, and I want to just show you a few more of his paintings because there's a real important point to this, is taking everyday life in New York and making it seem romantic in a way, and portraying an image of New York, not the bright lights of Broadway or the Opera House, but just regular New Yorkers. So if you look at the top left, for instance, that painting is literally just of three women on a hot summer night up on the roof, drying their hair, combing their hair, hanging some laundry. This is something you would never think in a million years that anybody would want to look at or especially buy. To the top right, a scene like that, the L train, one of the subways, the above the elevated train lines. This would be another thing John Sloan would paint a lot, is just transit, people moving from one place to another in New York. And what this starts to do, it starts to romanticize New York, and it starts to put New York into this, put into people's heads of this interesting, fascinating, romantic place. And it starts putting an image of people in their heads of what New York really looks like. And also, by the way, that top right photo, that building, he actually put his studios and his galleries were actually in that building on 6th Avenue in Greenwich Village. So actually where he created the art, where he sold the art, was featured in one of his paintings. So this is where we're going to really start to see the rise of the galleries, but also the space where they're actually going to create the art itself. Now, it's not just John Sloan who's going to have a big part in what's happening here, but another man named Burroughs is also going to have a very, very big impact here in New York and here on the art scene. One second, sorry about that. George Bellows, who was actually born in Ohio, but moved to New York, spent the rest of his life in New York. He was an American realist painter. This is one of his very famous paintings called Men on the Docks from 1912. And what's interesting about this and what about Bellows, again, he's trying to take what's considered to be a very seedy part of New York. You're down at the docks, you're looking at the dock workers. This is something that you would never think, again, why would anybody want to look at this? But this took off. This is something that would be extremely popular in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s. This idea of romanticizing what might be considered more of a darker side of New York. But people didn't see it that way. People started seeing value in this. Now, Burroughs himself, by the way, would be very important because not only is he part of the Ashcan School, he's actually one of the young members of the Ashcan School of Thinking, but he's also going to be a teacher. He's going to try to teach others the art that he knows and how he knows how to paint. And what he's going to do is he's going to work at the Arts Students League. And that is actually a very important part. Also, I'm only going to mention it quickly because I think it's a very important part of what that means to New York City, the Art Students League here in New York, because what that is here is, I'm just going to show you an image of that. The Art Student League was founded in the 1900s by a group of New York City artists. But what this does is, this is going to shift, because in New York, we had no art schools really before this, no real respectable art schools. So even if you wanted to go into that field, you would definitely go to Europe. You would definitely probably want to study in Paris. So the Art Student League is extremely important here in New York City, because what that's going to do, that's going to get artists to stay in New York, to train in New York, continue to paint in New York. And not only that, but what's very interesting about this, because this is very rare in New York, but their acceptance of women painters. So some very important women painters and sculptors, including Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, which we'll talk about later, will be educated here and will go on to pretty incredible careers here in New York City. Now, getting back to Bellows, because of his importance of what he did here in New York City and his painting style, what we're going to see is a very interesting coming together of the art world and the sports world, which is a big thing that's happening here in New York. This is actually a very, you probably recognize the painting. This is considered one of the most valuable paintings at the Whitney. Bellows painted this. This is actually the Dempsey Furco fight from 1924. What's interesting here, this was actually, he actually went to the fight, which was up at the Polo Grounds. That's where the New York Giants played. Originally it was here in Manhattan, on Manhattan Island. The New York Giants were the only real New York City team. But he actually went to see that fight and was inspired to do this painting. It was, at the time, it was one of the most famous fights ever in the history of America up to that point. So what's interesting about this, it's actually Jack Dempsey's not the one in the ring. Jack Dempsey's the one actually getting knocked out of the ring. He would climb back into the ring after this and actually knock out Flippo. But what's interesting again is that the painting itself, now they were taking something as simple as a sporting event in New York and putting it to canvas. And it's now considered a work of art. And it'll be another thing that's going to really start to elevate New York City in particular as a place that people would want to go. Now, Bellows himself with these paintings will, again, in a way, romanticize New York City, and it'll be an inspiration for people to come and want to come to New York City, especially people in the art world. Now, there's quite a few people that will be influenced by Bellows and Sloan, but it's not just painting alone. What we're also going to see that it's going to become very, very important is photography and how that is going to enter into the art world. Now, Alfred Steinlitz was an American photographer and modern art promoter. And basically, pretty much over his 50-year career, he's going to make photography a real accepted art here in America, and especially in New York City. I just want to show you the photo of the top left is probably one that most people would recognize. That's actually from the Grand Central Terminal. But he's going to have a major, major influence here in New York. He's actually born in Hoboken, but he'll spend most of his time in New York. He'll open up his studio here, his photography studio here in New York. And he will also start to open up art galleries in New York City. So he's going to be one of the people that is going to help lead the growing industry of art galleries here in New York City. And again, I think probably the biggest thing is helping the photography and the idea of photography, that it's actually in art. And he actually, most people will credit him to bringing it up to what we would consider to be as accepted an art form as, again, actual painting and sculptors. Now, what he'll do, one of the most important things he's going to do is, apart from his photography, there's two big things that a lot of people don't mention about his career. As I think that one of the most important will be one of the art galleries that he's actually going to open here in New York City. It's not so much just to feature his work. He's actually looking to promote many other people with this gallery. And this gallery is actually, I have it right here. Just give me 1 second. I'm sorry, folks. Let me take that back for a moment. It's known as the 291 Art Gallery, which was that was actually the address. It was on Fifth Avenue. And what this is going to do, this particular gallery, now there are many other galleries opening up at the same time throughout the teens, the 1920s, the 1930s. But what's really going to set his apart, which is really going to actually eventually help boost other galleries, is he's using the space to introduce Americans mainly to some of the most avant-garde European artists of the day, of that time. So he's really trying to help open up people's minds, that people can come see it, if need be, if want to purchase works of art. Now, some of the people that he's actually featuring in some of his galleries, Paul Cézanne, Henry Matisse, for instance, and one of his most important would be a Pablo Picasso. It'd be his first ever one-person exhibit in America. Held his first U.S. one-person exhibition in America at this gallery. Now, he would be in the gallery business basically from 1905 all the way up to 1917. But again, this would really help to make others realize the importance and how this industry was growing here in New York City. And by the time you get to the 1920s, now it has completely shifted the idea of the art world and what people think of, where you want to work, where you want to live, where you actually want to display your art to sell. It's completely shifted now to America, and again, mainly in New York City. And Alfred was definitely one of these people that were very influential in making this happen. Now, he's going to, while he's in New York, he's going to meet a young woman who also went to the Art and Students League, and he's going to be very impressed with her work. And he is going to he's going to reach out to her. And what he wants to do, I'm sorry about that. Let me just take that back for a minute. That other one will be coming up in a moment. Someone he's going to meet here in New York, and someone he's going to reach out to, and someone that he's going to really help really in her career. And I have it right here. Apologize about that. One more second. There we go. Is Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, again, she went to the Art Student League, and what Alfred does is that he will help her. And what he ends up doing is he ends up not only finding her an apartment to live in, he's actually going to find her the studio space to work in so that she could further her career. He actually believes in her that much that he's going to provide some financial support. And again, he'll arrange for a residence, and he will sort of help to push and to promote her career. The relationship between the two would develop so much that eventually they actually got married. And again, he'll really push and help her career. Now, she will quickly emerge as one of New York City's top artists, but it's not just the artwork that she's creating, which that in itself is very important, because she's actually doing very much the same that a lot of these other artists are doing here in New York. That is, in their artwork, they're portraying, they're showing New York in this very mysterious, romantic, some of her paintings in particular, instead of showing more of the rough edges of New York, she's showing a little bit more of the glamour of New York. The painting all the way to the right, that's the Radiator Building. That's actually right along Bryant Park on 42nd Street. Building itself is on 40th. If you go to Bryant Park, that building is still there. So she's starting to glamorize New York City. You got to keep in mind, before movies and television really took off, if you ask people today, and I see this a lot from the half of my career, which is the tourist industry, when we deal in the tourist industry part of our business, it's amazing how many people come in from all over the world or anywhere else in the country for that matter. They get their impressions of New York and they want to come to New York a lot of times through television and movies. And even when they get here, they often say when they're walking around, they feel like they're in a movie. They feel like they're on television. Well, before that, what really laid the groundwork for that were these artists, were these paintings. A matter of fact, those in television, but especially those that were making movies, were trying to sort of almost recreate what they were seeing in these paintings of New York City, something that they would become very influenced in their movie careers, to try to figure some way to capture that, what these people were doing in their artwork. Another thing about O'Keeffe that's very important, that she becomes very much part of what we would call, I guess you'd call sort of the art scene here in New York. But what we're seeing in New York City, that with the artists, O'Keeffe would be very good friends with a woman named Florine Stoudemire, who was also a very famous artist during this period. And what she was famous for was having lavish parties at her home, at her apartment here in New York, and basically bringing all different types of people together: artists, writers, painters, poets, just people in every possible, musicians, all these different entertainment type forms, all these different people from different types of culture together. And we're starting to see a melding in this in New York City. So that's going to help fuel the us becoming a center of the art world, because all these other fields are taking off at the same time, and a lot of these things are starting to combine together, these different types of fields. So that's going to make the New York City a very the center of the world, definitely in terms of culture. It's said a lot today, New York City is the cultural capital of the world, but it's really during this period of time where that's really happening, where they're really laying the foundations for this, and it's coming from the art world. That's really where it's coming from first. We'll have the Philharmonic, we'll have the opera, we have that too, of course, we have the theater, but really the art world is really what's helping to sort of get that message out. Now, not just Georgie O'Keeffe, and not just Alfred, but there's many others, and not only the scenes that are happening in the apartments, but when one would think of Paris and Europe in general, the Cafe Society, something here that in New York that's going to be very, very popular throughout this time. It's a more modern day photo because the building is still there. This place known as Cedar Tavern, which is down in Greenwich Village. And what's interesting here is that a very important part of the gallery scene, the art scene in New York, is people coming together to meet, to talk, to drink, to socialize. So when people again think of Cafe Society, think of Europe, Cedar Tavern actually is going to play a big part in that here in New York City. This is where people are going to start coming together, exchanging ideas, promoting each other's galleries are very important because a lot of these galleries are not easy to find. A lot of them could be on the second, third, fourth, fifth floor of the building. So word was getting out throughout the cafes. And again, what was very interesting is that it was taking that interesting lifestyle that seemed so alluring that you would have in Paris, and now it was being transferred to New York. Paris still has it, it still has it today, but New York City, when you think of Greenwich Village and you think of our cafes, this is where it's really going to start to get up and running. And through the artists, this is where it's going to take on, even here in the 21st century. Again, it's an important part of New York, and it's an alluring part, this idea that we are a cafe society also. So that's going to play a big part in the art scene is Cedar Tavern and other cafes and stuff that we have around all over the city, not just Greenwich Village. Now, there's going to be quite a few other galleries, quite a few other artists, but I want to mention Julian Levet Gallery. Julian Levet is also one of many different people that would open up galleries here in New York City. And what was interesting about his galleries in particular is, again, this idea of bringing not just New York artists, but the foreign artists that were becoming very big and very popular throughout Europe and becoming very famous. So someone like Salvador Dali, for instance. So in his Levet's galleries, he would start featuring a lot of the work of these, not unknown around the world, but unknown in New York and unknown in America, artists. So whereas some of these works would not have been displayed yet in our museums, because that's a big difference here with these galleries. A lot of the artists that I mentioned before, and people from the Armory Show, a lot of that artwork had yet to make it into our museums. So when you think of the Whitney, when you think of the Metropolitan Museum, actually the Whitney itself had even started yet when the Armory Show happened, but they're not finding their ways into the museums as of yet. What's really important about this period of time, the teens, the 20s, the 30s, is that it's the galleries. That's the only place that you were able to go see this artwork and perhaps purchase this artwork. The museums in New York would kind of get on much later, get on board to the idea of buying some of these works, and they would start to realize the importance of this new type of artwork that was taking the world by storm. Now, a perfect example of this would be Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She's a perfect example of what I was trying to explain before, where now she in particular, by the way, came from a very wealthy family. She has a fascinating story on her own. Gertrude, her middle name is Vanderbilt, and last name is Whitney, both extremely wealthy families in New York. She had a real desire to not only be an artist herself, but she was very much part of this scene. She would try to encourage other artists, especially American artists and women artists. She would actually help provide not only gallery space to show their work, but more importantly, studios. So you'd have the Whitney Studio here in New York. So those that can create the artwork there, perhaps display it, and if they couldn't sell it, she started buying work. So she was trying to literally personally support a lot of these young new artists that were here in New York and purchasing their artwork. What's interesting was by the 1930s, she started realizing how much she actually had. She also knew that she was not going to live forever. So she actually approached the Metropolitan Museum of Art and offered all this artwork from all these new modern type artists, and they actually turned it down. Now, not only did she offer the artwork, by the way, she actually offered to build a new wing to the Met. Not to knock anybody at the Met, by the way, because at the time, that was the general feeling in America, is that American art was just considered almost worthless. And even a lot of what was coming over from Europe, the Cubist, the Futurist type artwork, American Impressionism, it was just not considered anything that was worth of value. So it's not really the Met's fault, but they actually were offered to build an entire wing to house this art. It'll probably work out for the better in the long run, because what Whitney will do is actually go and just decide to own up her own museum. And by the way, other museums would start to flourish through New York because of this idea of New York is becoming sort of this new capital. So people like Henry Frick will leave his house and his home to have that turned into a museum. It would be many years later, but like the Noyer Gallery, for instance, museum, and other museums will start to open up all over New York City. But a lot of that is coming from the original galleries that were all over here, all over New York City. Now, a very important part that's sort of intertwined between all of this is not just who's creating the art, but who's talking about the art and who's helping to promote the art. You know, how is word getting out about the art and the artwork? And I'm sorry, I'm going to go back for 1 second. I apologize about that. Let me just pop back here for a minute. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to show you this too. That is Salvador Dali on the top right, and that is when he first brought some of his artwork here to America. I just didn't want to let that slide by. So the question is, who's going to help to actually start promoting some of this art here in New York City? One of the people that is going to be very influential here in New York is, believe it or not, will be art critics. This is Clement Greenberg. He's an American essayist, influential art critic. And he's actually extremely important here in New York. He's born and bred in New York, born in the Bronx, eventually died here in New York. But he's the one who's mainly responsible to help making American modern art become really popular in the mid 20th century. He's the one that really looked at abstract expressionism and really felt that this was a way that money could be made in this. So by criticizing it, and I don't necessarily want to say it in a negative way, but by writing reviews about artists and artwork, that in itself really helped in the movement, especially in the 1940s, of making this popular. And he really achieved international influence by doing this. And he really helped take Western art and really helped to put it sort of at the center of the art world. And one of the things that he did, and one of the people that he was actually very close with, was an American artist, which Greenberg would actually help promote and help eventually in even with possible sales of some paintings, would be Jackson Pollock. You know, again, American artists, this was an American artist who were really starting to get recognition around the world and really started to become popular around the world. but by paint in New York, it would help to fuel the gallery scene, the museum scene here in New York City. And Greenberg was very influential again in helping to promote Pollock. So it was very interesting, the two careers, because the more popular that Pollock became, the more popular that Greenberg played, and the two of them, their careers were growing at the same time. But again, just the art world itself, this modern art, it all was rising at the same time throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s because of these people. Now, as the scene is continuing to grow here in New York City, just want to point this out. It's getting back to Burroughs, as someone who I talked about a little bit earlier, is these people would be alive throughout the mid 20th century, and as their artwork became more and more popular, it would go from the gallery scene. Now we would see where museums are actually going to become very engaged in trying to buy this artwork and trying to feature this artwork in their museums. So by the 1940s, going into the 1950s, and then definitely going into the 1960s, we're going to see the popularity of this artwork grow throughout the United States, and probably more importantly, especially for the artist, the values of these paintings. This is really going to start to grow throughout this period, and this is really going to help starting to fuel the art market here in New York City. And by the time you get to the 1950s, New York City is firmly established as the art center of the world. And again, it is true for the painting, is to go to school here, it is to showcase your work, it is to sell your work, it is perhaps have it seen in a museum. And again, most of this will be fueled through the very important gallery scene here in New York City. Now, this is going to continue throughout the 1950s, going into the 1960s, and then beyond. That in itself is another topic. And I just wanted to say that what we had seen earlier in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1950s, the influence of these artists and the influence of this scene in general will keep New York City as a magnet that going forward, which we might discuss in another day, we'll see how New York City will be challenged as being one of the art centers of the world, and how we will continue to lay the groundwork to stay the center of the art world. Bottom photo there in the setting, that's Andy Warhol. And what we're going to see is this continuing of the fashion world. In these photos you're looking at, that's Cary Grant on the top right. So we'll see movie stars, Farrah Fawcett. You'll see writers like on the bottom. You'll see the different writers and movie stars and actors and actresses. And normally I wouldn't care about that industry when I'm talking about the art world, but it's important because they're starting to really mix and really starting to come together. Most people give credit to that to the 60s and 70s, but it really had its genesis back, all starting, by the way, with that original Armory show. So that is really what is really going to really kick open the door for New York City and really put New York City at the top of the art world. And one can read quite a bit about the Armory Art Show. For those that know about it, I would suggest maybe even reading more into it. And for those that didn't know about it, I hope you'd want to go in to read more about the Armory Show, because again, that is really going to lay the groundwork for what we're going to see and why New York City and why the galleries in New York are some of the most important in the world. And on that note, I really would like to open it up to questions, because I want to make sure I have time to answer everybody's questions if there is questions.
Well, Kevin, thank you again. This was truly an extraordinary talk. And I know that I tasked you with kind of an impossible feat of the start of New York City art galleries in the 20th century. And I think you really gave a wonderful introduction and kind of to kick it off with the Armory Show. I know something that as I was kind of going through university and starting to understand kind of the rise of the art world in America, and kind of this was such a pivotal moment. And I know we already have our first question come in, so let me open it up and get Mary's question over to her. Just give me a moment as I kind of look at this here. So Mary, I've opened it up for you. If you just unmute yourself.
Okay. My question is, you mentioned Stieglitz as having the first gallery in the United States, which I didn't realize. Do you have basically a list of, say, like the first 5 or 10 galleries, and who they were and when they were and where they were? That's a loaded
Well,
question, I know.
there were so many of them. Now, it's interesting because when you're doing when you're doing research, I should say, on that, and you're trying to pinpoint, who had the first and where was it. It is amazing how, because most of these, by the way, his first gallery was in an apartment. That's where he first had it. Okay,
I'm assuming that was his apartment where he lived, and they allocated maybe 1 or so rooms to be a private gallery, as people do today.
That's how they did it. Yes. By the way, Guggenheim, before the Guggenheim Museum started, his apartment, he had an apartment in the Plaza Hotel. Way before he even started building the Guggenheim Museum, he basically had his apartment as almost like an art gallery. He would invite people over, and that was the art gallery. Yeah. So this had been done before, but, or I should say later. So yes, it would have been in his apartment. So there's actually other people that would have done that similarly throughout New York City. Many women artists would do this. So to give you an exact list, there's quite a few of them. I mean, you could always email me. I could send you a couple of, I could jot down a couple for you just so you can look it up. But his was the one that really, 291 Art Gallery was basically the name of it. That's the one that was really, it'd be probably the most important. So in other words, if there's other people that say, no, mine was the first. Mm-hmm. His was the one that was probably the most important as a first. Because again, having the Picasso exhibit, mm-hmm. People sometimes ask, why are Picasso so valuable? It's this period of time. It's being shown, having a one-man show at that guy's apartment, at his gallery. That's where the buzz early on is going to start to get created. So I hope that answers your question. I kind of gave you a long answer there, but it was in his apartment.
No, I'm intrigued by this. Do you know if he had public viewings, or was it by appointment only?
I would assume that it would have probably been appointment only. I just throwing that out there. I would have to double check on some of my notes on that. I'm pretty sure because it was an apartment. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure if he was a doorman building. If he was a doorman building, he might have needed an appointment. I'm not sure. You probably would have needed an appointment in an apartment. I think most people probably would have done it that way.
Probably one of the first tax deductions too for a gallery.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Be surprised. Yes. Absolutely.
Thank you for your answering my questions.
Oh, absolutely.
Do we have any other questions? I know I have a couple that I might kind of throw at you too, unless we have some more questions from the audience. I'll give it a moment. Okay. So, I mean, I think Kevin, kind of, you were talking about the Cedar Tavern is something that I've always been fascinated about by kind of its role in New York City in the art gallery scene, kind of being able to pull all of those artists together. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more kind of about that dynamic of kind of that time period and its role in the art scene.
One of the big things about Cedar Tavern and other places like it in the neighborhood, the reason that it was so, there's one other person I wanted to mention too is Alfred Barr, but might give a minute on that. The reason it was so important is because a lot of it was what people thought when they were going into this field. If you wanted to become an artist, for instance, part of the allure of going, one of the reasons why you wanted to go to Paris or go to Europe was to experience that life. Again, there was something about that cafe society that people had this romantic impression in their head of what that meant and what that was supposed to be. So before places like the Cedar Tavern, we really didn't have that here at all. You really didn't have those kind of places where poets, writers, artists could go and meet and have a drink together. You had more places like McSorley's or Francis Tavern. It was a different, completely different vibe to the people that would be in there, where you were very unlikely to run into a fellow artist or musician or poet in most of our bar or coffee houses. So places like Cedar Tavern, the reason it was so important, because people would start to realize there were places to go where you could socialize with people. And I'm not even getting into the other issues socially, where if you, for instance, has to be talked about because it's important, but if you were gay or lesbian, for instance, people that from around America especially were very afraid to sort of be themselves anywhere else in America. So one of the things that was happening at Cedar Tavern and some of these other places, that when they came to, say, Greenwich Village, nobody cared really about that. They didn't care who you were dating, what your background was. I know that doesn't sound like so revolutionary today. It's just more common and it's more accepted, of course. But back almost 100 years ago, that was not the case at all. So that was another whole layer to this. So if you were an artist, a poet, a writer, not only could you go to speak to others like yourself, meaning that you're in that field, but even your sexual orientation was something that you could feel relaxed and calm about and meet other people like you, whatever that may be. So whoever you want to date. So that was a big part of it too. So it wasn't just from an art world perspective, it was also from a social aspect to really being able to relax and be yourself. That's one of the reasons why the Village became such a magnet for people from all over the world that had the desire to express their talents in something creative, but also just be human beings and just be able to be themselves also.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I always kind of think about the Cedar Tavern too, between Jackson Pollock and William de Kooning, Mark Rothko, Franz Klein, all part of that abstract expressionist movement. So it's really the first kind of, I think about it as the first kind of ism of art history in the United States, coming out of that group of artists and art critics, Clement Greenberg, coming together, and that kind of concentration of artists, critics together at that one bar, and the movements, and really kind of the kickoff of kind of that first ism of art history in the United States, in New York City at that time, coming out of that bar. And I do have, before we kind of go on to the next, another topic here, I do have another question that I'm going to allow to speak. Ginny, I think you need to unmute yourself.
So one thing that I also wanted to say, which I think I take your point and Kevin's points about the Cedar Tavern, but what's interesting is we often think of all the male abstract expressionist artists, but not often about the female abstract expressionist artists, including Lee Krasner, who became, as many know, became Jackson Pollock's wife. But the fact of the matter is that the women were not happy at the Cedar Tavern. It was a very rough and tumble place. People would fight, they'd get drunk. And so several of the women abstract expressionist artists refused to go there after a certain point. Now that began to change, of course, but it's interesting. Sometimes we forget in all of this that there were excellent women who were abstract expressionist artists too.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, that's why I tried to add Georgia O'Keeffe. I tried that. That's why I wanted to have her in there too. But you're absolutely right. That was actually happening at the same time, correct?
Mhm. And I think just for my colleagues and myself, I mean, we've seen, and especially in the art market today, is such a resurgence and interest in those female artists kind of that time period, and also kind of stemming through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s into today. And of course, that's something that I know we weren't able to cover the second half of the 20th century New York City art gallery scene in today's talk, but I think that's something that we'll really get into more. I probably in the next couple of months will have kind of the second part here for us to do a little of a more of a deeper dive into the second half of the 20th century, and a little teaser: Studio 54, Andy Warhol, Keith Haring, Jean-Michel Basquiat, one of my personal favorites, and kind of what was happening with some of the other major developments of Chelsea as a New York City kind of gallery hub as well.
Yes.
Well, I think we're just at time here, and I want to be considerate of everyone's evening and dinner and drink plans. So I wanted to thank you again for joining us tonight. And as you'll see in the chat box, we do have Kevin's website here. So if you have any follow-up questions or want to see about some of the other tours of New York that he has been hosting, or some private one-on-one tours that I know he has been doing with his clients throughout the city, if you want to take advantage of the warm weather and get out and do some walking tours of New York. I know Kevin's really, it's one thing to go through these photographs, but it is another thing to get to see it in person. So thank you again, Kevin, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for all of the attendees this evening. And if you want a copy of this recording, it is made available after tonight's talk. So you can reply to the email invite that you received, and we can send you that recording. And if you have any follow-up questions, we would be happy to answer them for you. And thank you again for joining us this evening. And Kevin, again, thank you so much.
Have a good evening, everybody. It was a pleasure. Thank you.